William, thank you very much for being my guest again on Syriana Analysis. You recently published a very interesting article, actually, on the Libertarian Institute. The title of the article goes by "Sarin Doesn't Slice Throats: The 2013 Ghouta Massacre Revisited." It's a very long article, but I encourage everyone to go and read the article. I put the link in the description below. For those who are interested in to read more about the Syrian literature, from the Syrian war literature, because there are lots of narratives and counter narratives. And at the end of the day, you read by yourself and you judge whether you agree or disagree, or if you're convinced or not, right? And there are many points that you have made in this. I would call it like a graduation project, to be honest. They're very interesting, especially regarding one of the major events in the Syrian war, which was the Ghouta 2013 chemical attack, when the narrative was the Syrian government or the Syrian army headed by President Bashar al-Assad used sarin gas on eastern Ghouta, which is on the suburbs of Damascus, for those who don't know, on the August of 21st, 2013, which led to lots of casualties. And if you check the numbers, 1,429 civilians died, including 456. And any sane person, if you see this amount of casualties, you would be emotionally, the least to say, irritated, and you would like the international community to do something about it, right? And the media was accusing the government of Syria of using a chemical weapon. And this, we're talking about sarin gas, not even a chlorine gas, which is way more dangerous than the chlorine gas. So the general perception was that Assad used this sarin gas, and it was like in a few minutes they concluded it. And there were so many videos circulating showing dead bodies of children and civilians and women. But in the article that you posted a few days ago, you said that new information has surfaced that negates the mainstream narrative regarding the Ghouta chemical attack. What are this new information that the public should know?
Well, as I mentioned in the article, even at the time the attack happened, there was quite a lot of information indicating that the Syrian government did not carry it out. But in subsequent years, additional information has come to light, and maybe the most important is from a study done by a group called Root Claim, Adam Larson and Michael Cobbs, where they determined that, by looking at the angles of the rockets that had landed in eastern Ghouta, that there's just no way that those rockets came from government-held territory at the time. And specifically, they were able to identify the specific field from which all of the rockets were fired. And there is a video that was released by the Salafist militia that was in control of that area at the time. I'm sure your listeners will know Liwa al-Islam or Jaish al-Islam, led by Zahran Aloush. So that group, they really identified that, hey, this is where the rockets came from. And, it just proves that the Syrian government didn't do it. So again, maybe many of your listeners are already aware of that report. I think it came out in just about a year ago, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So that's some new information that conclusively shows that the Syrian government didn't do it. But again, in my article, I try to provide a really broad overview and look at the context of what was going on when the attack happened, and basically just try to deal with literally all of the arguments from both sides about who did what and why, and just to kind of put the whole picture together that includes both, the political situation and the build up to the attack at the time, plus this new information that has come to light in subsequent years.
So first we have the location of the missiles that were fired on Ghouta, we would say, on the 21st of August 2013. And were there any satellite images regarding this, or the conclusion is mostly based on eyewitnesses and analysis, let's say, of how the missile, from where the missile has been fired and how it landed in Ghouta back then?
Well, it's interesting that the White House claimed at the time that they had satellite imagery proving, where the rockets came from. And they were asked by members of the media, if I remember, the Associated Press and others, to release the satellite imagery. And of course, they refused to. So turns out they were just lying, of course. But it's just based on what's called the azimuth, or the angle that the rockets would land and hit the ground in these different areas. And once you know that angle of how the rocket hit the ground and gets stuck in the ground in the dirt, and also knowing the range of the rockets, like whether a rocket could potentially fly 3 kilometers or 9 kilometers. Once you know that, you can do the calculations, which is what this group from Root Claim did. And they were able to basically show that all of the rockets in the eastern Ghouta area all came from this one particular field. And again, later on, there was a video that emerged of militants from Liwa al-Islam firing a rocket, and they were able to look at that specific video, and using satellite imagery or Google Earth, they could identify the features in that particular video, and that location fits perfectly where where all the angles of the different rockets all match up. And so early on, there was the argument by the New York Times and Human Rights Watch that the rockets that contain the sarin had like a 9-kilometer range, but then that was proved incorrect by Ted Postel of MIT. And so anyways, all that can be used to show where the rockets actually came from, and it did not come from a Syrian military base as was initially claimed.
So if before we jump to the motives, right, each sides of this conflict have motives in using any sort of weapons, and the aftermath of using a weapon. What do you want to achieve? Your goal in firing, let's say, a certain type of missile or a rocket. But before addressing that, when we talk about Liwa al-Islam or Jaish al-Islam, and this is a group, they had we can say safely tens of thousands of fighters, right? In Ghouta, at least 20,000 fighters back then. Where do you think they could get such materials like a sarin gas? Because this type of materials are very difficult to be smuggled and to be transferred to groups such as Liwa al-Islam for them to use such a weapon, right?
Yeah. So the first thing to mention is that they actually didn't have a whole lot of sarin, and we can talk about this later. This goes to the title of the article, Sarin Doesn't Slice Throats. In other words, most of the victims of the attack didn't actually die of sarin gas. They died in other ways that we can discuss. So when Liwa Islam fired the rockets containing the sarin, they didn't have enough sarin to actually cause mass casualties or kill a lot of people. They just shot I even forget the number, maybe 7, 10, 13 rockets that contained just enough sarin for there essentially to be traces of it, so that when the UN investigators came in, they could, take environmental samples and see that there was some sarin fired. But again, the quantities, it turns out, just weren't very large. And so that suggests that, again, it would be much easier for al-Islam to get at least small amounts of sarin to carry out this type of a false flag attack. And the most likely source is from the Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. There are a lot of reports coming out of Turkey that Nusra Front militants were trying to acquire the sarin and the precursors needed to produce sarin, and that they had the ability to do that. And there were various reports from U.S. intelligence suggesting that Nusra did have that capability. that Seymour Hersh reported about. In addition to the fact that, again, in Turkey, there were a number of Nusra Front militants who were arrested with these precursors in their possession. So probably there, again, with all these sectarian Salafist opposition groups that were supported by the Saudis and the U.S., etc., they all, tended to work pretty closely together. So either the Nusra Front would have given the sarin to Liwa al-Islam, or it's possible that even Liwa al-Islam got the sarin from, say, Saudi intelligence directly. That's the other thing to remember, is that all these groups had, major state sponsors. So it's wrong to think of these groups as being independent actors, like, the opposition versus the Syrian government. All these opposition groups, in particular, Liwa al-Islam, they had strong Saudi intelligence support from Prince Bandar. So it would be, quite easy for them to acquire at least small quantities of chemical like sarin.
I would like to ask you about Bandar bin Sultan, but before that, the motive is very important here, right? And in August 2013, the Syrian army was preparing for a pushback on these Islamists in Eastern Ghouta, and they were already in a military, let's say, hostilities with these Islamists, right? And this attack came at a time when the Syrian army was trying to push them back, but what motive both sides could have? What motive could the Syrian government have in using chemical weapons like sarin gas on these so-called rebels, and what motive the Islamists could have in whether staging such an attack, or even it could be a theater, or it could be staged in both cases? What are the motives of both sides?
Well, again, as far as the Syrian government goes, there really was just no possible motive, and even U.S. and British intelligence, when the attack happened in August 2013, they couldn't even provide a possible rationale for why the Syrian government would do that. President Obama had declared the so-called red line, and a year earlier, in August 2012, and in fact, it was Israeli planners who first kind of floated the idea of this red line. It wasn't Obama's idea. In my view, the Israelis floated the idea as a way to kind of trap Obama, and we can talk about that more later. But from that point in time, everyone knew what the incentives were. Even Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had said in January 2013, 2013, that, hey, the Russians and the Syrians understood that because Obama had stated this idea of a red line, that if any chemical weapons are used, that would be justification for the U.S. to intervene. Even Martin Dempsey said in January 2013 that was a massive deterrent for the Syrians to ever use chemical weapons. And in addition, but theoretically, if the Syrian government would do that, maybe betting that the United States was bluffing or Obama wouldn't intervene or something like that, presumably they might use chemical weapons if they were just totally desperate. If Damascus was on the verge of being overrun by these al-Qaeda linked Salafist militias, and Assad, was going to be, taken captive and murdered like Gaddafi was, presumably that might be a reason that the Syrian government would use chemical weapons just out of total desperation. But in fact, the situation in Damascus at the time was the complete opposite. As you mentioned, the Syrian government was on the offensive. It was starting to look like the Syrian government was going to clearly win the war. And U.S. planners were in a panic at the time. The Qatari intelligence had kind of was in the lead in supporting the so-called rebels at the time. And when the town of Qusair near the Lebanese border fell in May 2013, if I remember, that was a major blow to the opposition. That was a pathway through which they got a lot of weapons. coming from Lebanon that would for the Salafist militants to carry out attacks in homes. And the White House was basically panicking, given that Qusair had fallen, and there were just lots of indications that the Syrian government was really in a strong position in 2013, and everyone was expecting that Assad wasn't going anywhere, despite all the pronouncements of these different Western-backed politicians. So there's just no indication that the Syrian government was in a weak position at all. And in addition, again, we could talk about this more, but in my view, it's important to view this chemical attack in the context of the broader regime change operation that U.S. and Saudi planners had initiated, starting way back in 2005. And, by 2012, that had taken the form of the Timber Sycamore program of the CIA that, has been talked about a lot. So again, there was a regime change effort that had been launched even before the outbreak of the protests of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, which again, as I've shown in other articles, was manufactured by the United States, specifically by the State Department, the protests. But so this was just the next step. And the next step was there had to be Western military intervention to topple Assad. Obama was reluctant to give the green light for that. And so there was no way that the rebels themselves, the so-called rebels, were going to win. They could prolong the war, engage in a lot of violence, kill a lot of people, but they weren't actually going to win. And so the next step was to, in the regime change operation, was to do the false flag attack, to trigger that red line, to get permission from Obama to go ahead and start a Western bombing campaign, just like the one that had taken place in Libya. So all the incentive was with the United States, with the CIA, with Saudi intelligence, with the British and French intelligence, and with the Salafist militant groups. They were the ones that needed a false flag attack in order to complete the regime change effort that had been started years and years ago, but that Obama was standing in the way of because he wouldn't green light a full scale intervention.
Why did Obama, why was he hesitant at the first place? And if we remember, he was very close in striking Damascus in September 2013, and the last moment he backed off. Politically speaking and militarily speaking, politically, I mean, he could have known that there is no concrete intelligence information. But militarily speaking, was there also a possibility that this could escalate into a different type of warfare that made him backed off?
Well, I think there were certain factions in the U.S. foreign policy establishment that were for the attack, specifically the CIA, John Brennan. But then there were other factions that were against it, James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, and then most strongly Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Martin Dempsey warned, hey, if the United States intervenes in response to this red line, that basically we shouldn't do that because we would just be intervening on the side of al-Qaeda. And from his perspective, that was a crazy thing to do for the United States to directly intervene on the side of al-Qaeda. Of course, the United States had used al-Qaeda from the very beginning and supplied them weapons, courtesy of the Saudis and the Qataris to do that. But Dempsey was opposed to a full-scale intervention. So Obama, I think, I don't think so again, once the chemical attack happened, all the videos came out, there was so much pressure that he did agree, okay, we're going to do the intervention. And he started pushing forward and saying, we're going to do it. But I think as about the week or two went by after the attack, again, there was pushback from Dempsey, there was pushback from James Clapper, and Obama started to realize, hey, this is really unpopular. If I launch a full scale intervention, kind of like Bush did in 2003, it's going to come back and bite me. If it goes poorly, number one, it's going to be illegal under international law. The Republicans in the Senate and the Congress didn't want it. And I think he really honestly felt like he would get impeached if he went through with it. So there was all this pressure on him from these different intelligence agencies to do it. And I just think he knew he would be the one that would be left holding the bag and catch all the blame if something went wrong. And so because of that, he tried to find a way to kind of weasel out of the intervention, which he had already agreed to. And he did that by saying, hey, wait, why don't I just, refer this to Congress? If Congress approves it, then we'll go ahead. That way if things go bad, just like Bush, Bush could say, well, I thought the weapons of mass destruction were there. And, the CIA thought that too. And the Congress voted to go to war, Bush had all these people with him to kind of blunt him taking all the blame himself. But Obama didn't have any of that. Not even, again, the director of national intelligence, James Clapper, would even issue a formal finding from the intelligence agencies to say that Assad did carry out the chemical attack. Instead, he just told Ben Rhodes, Obama's aide, to write the assessment claiming that it had happened. And even Ben Rhodes acknowledged that he himself was scared of getting, pulled up in front of Congress and having to testify in hearings about why they had done this illegal intervention. So Obama, it's not like he's a hero. It's not like he's an anti-war, has any anti-war principles, but he just realized he would get blamed. And so Obama, found a way to weasel out of the intervention, but then he did continue to authorize for the CIA, again with the help of the Saudis and the Qataris, to keep sending weapons to the Salafist militias and the jihadists in subsequent years. And it wasn't until 2017, when Trump was president, that Timber Sycamore program was finally canceled.
Yeah, you mentioned the Saudis and Bandar bin Sultan, and during this period, Bandar bin Sultan became the head of the Saudi intelligence and Jaish al-Islam, or these Islamist groups in Ghouta, were mostly supported by Saudi Arabia. Do you find any possibility or potential link between Bandar bin Sultan, or Bandar Bush, as his nickname is, and the attack in the chemical attack in Eastern Ghouta?
Yeah, I don't have documents or admissions, to prove it, but in my view, again, this attack, the regime change operation against the Syrian government started, in 2005 when Prince Bandar was collaborating with neoconservatives in Dick Cheney's office. And that's when all the plans for this intervention began that actually culminated, in this effort to do a full-scale Western intervention after the chemical attack in 2013. And Prince Bandar was there every step of the way. He's the one that, was organizing the al-Qaeda groups before 2011, along with Saad Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon. They were kind of like, the agents on the ground for the United States, so to speak. Hariri and Bandar sending weapons into the al-Qaeda affiliate, into Syria, for the al-Qaeda militants to attack Syrian security forces, police, and the army under the cover of those initial protests, starting in March 2011. And it was Bandar's, project to topple the Syrian government. And when Qusayr fell in May 2013, that's when he kind of took a more direct, hands-on role. In fact, that probably even started earlier in the summer of 2012. He and David Petraeus were collaborating to send weapons into the Salafist militias, and that's, in my view, where the formal Timber Sycamore program really started. Was the collaboration between Petraeus and Bandar, where they were setting up a big operations center in Jordan in the summer of 2012. And then again, a year later is when they pulled off the falsified chemical attack to try to get the Western intervention started. And there's just so much evidence that the U.S. and the Saudis were preparing to intervene militarily under the guise of a no-fly zone, even in the summer of 2013, in the 2 or 3 months before the Ghouta attack. They sent F-16s and Patriot missiles to Jordan, and they escalated weapon shipments to all the rebel groups. One FSA commander in particular that talked about this was Qassam Saadeddin, I think is his name. And
Yes.
there are a lot of reports that, that again, these guys were expecting the bombing campaign. They got a huge influx of additional weapons even before the Ghouta chemical attack was carried out. In the days right before, there are reports from the French newspaper Le Figaro that that rebels trained in Jordan by the CIA had been infiltrated into the country and had reached as far as Ghouta, and that they were accompanied by Israeli and Jordanian and CIA trainers. And that all happened in literally the days before the Ghouta chemical attack. So all of these preparations were being made for the large-scale Western intervention, the bombing campaign that would allow the rebels to then sweep into Damascus and take over power. And the only thing remaining, the final piece of the puzzle, was to simply get Obama to sign off. And so the Ghouta chemical attack, with the videos that, of course, instantly went viral and were pushed by all the CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, all of that was just perfectly timed for an intervention to be launched according to all the preparations that had been made in the previous 3 months. I mean, it's just totally obvious if you look at the context. And an additional part of all those preparations were to do other smaller fake chemical attacks. In the few months preceding in May, June, and June. And we could talk about those more if you like. In the attack in Sheikh Maqsood and in Saraka.
Yes.
And of course, that has a lot to do with the attack in Khan al-Assad that took place in March 2013. So again, if you like, we could talk a little bit more about those.
Yes, I would really like to talk about this incidents, but before that, Bandar bin Sultan, I would like to mention an information here that I already published on Syriana Analysis. I translated a video for the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, Hamad bin Jassim, who said that when Bandar came as the head of the intelligence, he invited the foreign ministers of the countries hostile towards Syria. And he asked the Gulf countries to raise $2 trillion to overthrow Assad in Syria. And he mentioned this on a Qatari national TV, and I subtitled it on Syriana Analysis. I don't think they were capable of collecting $2 trillion. I think it's a crazy number. But I'm just my subjective opinion. It's above $200 billion in Syria. The amount of money that the influx of money from the Gulf countries, at least in Syria. But you mentioned Khan al-Assad incident, and this was also at almost the same time. It was in March 19th, 2013. And back then, the Syrian government claimed that the rebels used chemical materials against the Syrian army soldiers, and accordingly asked Ban Ki-moon to send investigators. And he appointed or tasked the OPCW, right, to come to Syria to investigate. But don't you think, of course, the attack happened in March 19th, and the Syrian government sent, I think, the letters on the 22nd or the 21st of March to the UN. And it took them so long till August to send investigators. And between these periods, as you mentioned, few fake chemical attacks happened in order to erase what happened against the Syrian government forces, right? And but when the investigators arrived in Damascus, just a few days later, the Ghouta chemical attack happened. So the OPCW investigators were in Syria when the attack happened, right?
Yeah, and so that's another thing with the timing. Again, in addition to the fact that it's just totally crazy that Assad would happen to do a chemical attack just as the CIA was sending commandos into Syria from Jordan and sending huge amounts of weapons to FSA groups in preparation for an assault on Damascus that depended on a Western bombing campaign as cover. Just as that is just entirely totally improbable that Assad would carry out a chemical attack just when the United States and the CIA and Prince Bandar needed him to in order to justify what they were trying to do. In addition, it's just totally crazy to think that Assad, who had invited the UN weapons inspectors led by Sellstrom to Damascus to investigate the attack in Khan al-Assad, which again the Syrian government felt like was a total slam dunk, that the opposition or that Nusra was responsible for that one. They were confident enough to say, hey, we better get the UN inspectors in here. And to think that Assad would then carry out a chemical attack 3 days after the inspectors arrive in Damascus to investigate a different chemical attack that he claimed. And there was good reason to believe that the opposition, probably Nusra, had carried out. I mean, again, it's just crazy to believe that kind of a story,
But William, we are talking from an angle that Assad is the same person, right? Or a stable person. But in the mainstream media, they portray him as an unstable, insane dictator, butcher who wakes up every morning checking on the map where to kill the people, right? How would you assess President Assad's policies during this period of time when the pressure was very high, I would say, on Syria? And this was the time it either crumbles, the regime, or it continues, right? It is chemical attacks, or some of them were staged or not. But this era, 2013 and 2012, they were very crucial. The rebels were attacking on Damascus, al-Nusra was committing genocide in many places. And some would say Assad was desperate and he was also unstable, so he used these weapons. So how do you assess Assad's policy in this period? From a point of view of a person who is an outside observer, I would say, you're not a Syrian.
Well, if you believe at all that President Assad was trying to, a generous interpretation that he was just trying to keep the state together and defeat, these terrorist groups from his perspective. But even if you had taken a more cynical view that he doesn't care about Syrians at all and he just wants to stay in power, so he and his, cronies or whatever can continue through corruption, fleecing the country, and then, murdering Syrians because they think it's fun. Even if you take that extremely cynical and, in my view, incorrect view of Assad, it still would just not make any sense for him to launch a chemical attack at that time. Later, or maybe earlier in the summer of 2012, there was a big rebel offensive on Damascus, and a number of Assad's close aides were killed in a bombing of the National Security Building. And,
Yes.
That's a time you could say, well, maybe Assad could have gotten desperate and used chemical weapons. Or, of course, later on in, 2015, just before the Russian intervention, when ISIS was pressuring Damascus, both from Yarmouk camp and from the direction of Palmyra, and then Nusra had taken over Idlib. That's a time when the Syrian government was in serious danger of falling, and these different al-Qaeda groups were on the verge of raising the black flag over Damascus and massacring every Alawite and Christian inside the city, and pro-government Sunnis. Those would have been times, but in the summer of 2013, no, it was just the opposite. The Syrian government was, the tide was definitely in their favor, and it was American planners and it was Saudi planners that were desperate. And they even admitted as much in June 2013, the White House. There was a report I cited in the article where it mentions that Obama's advisors were all, panicked and desperate, again, because Qusayr had just fallen. And, they felt like they were losing the war and they had to do something big to turn the tide against Assad. And again, that was in the form of preparing for implementing a no-fly zone or a full-scale intervention by sending the F-16s and the Patriot missiles to Jordan and sending all these additional weapons to the so-called rebels. And again, the final piece in the puzzle was we just need to trigger that, we just need to trigger that red line. We just need to trigger that red line, and everything's going to work out perfect for our
It looks like the Israelis. For me, it looks like the Israelis tried also to trap Obama by drawing this red line or trying to lobby him to draw this red line, and then in collaboration or coordination with the Saudis to launch or to stage such a chemical attack in Syria. But I would like to make a point here for those who don't know why Al-Qusayr battle was very important in 2012 when the Islamists occupied the city of Qusayr, which borders Lebanon. And it was the military intention was to occupy this city that borders Lebanon and try to block any sort of communication and connection and I would say any attempt of cooperation between Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also to overrun later Lebanon by these jihadists after they overthrow Syria, and to corner Hezbollah in the south through the north from Tarablos, from Baalbek, and all the way to Beirut. So it was a plan to also bring Lebanon into the scene, because one of the main players in the Middle East that is definitely goes against the American, let's say, hegemony in the region is Hezbollah. So of course, removing Assad is very important, but only removing him was not enough. So Qusayr was very important for them to have an access or project this project also onto Lebanon. And unfortunately, even like you mentioned, Saad Hariri was the former prime minister. He was collaborating with the Saudis and the Americans in this project. And even the Christian, I would put it between quotation, the phalanges, they were also collaborating with the Saudis in this regard because of their hatred towards Hezbollah. And I would like to mention, like, the Phalanges are a minority Christian group in Lebanon, and they are they are portrayed as right-wing fascists there, and they have committed horrendous war crimes during the Lebanese civil war. And there are also other Lebanese Christian group, which is the larger bloc, belongs to Michel Aoun. And they are more or less pro-Syria and pro-Hezbollah. So it's very complex situation, I would say, there in Lebanon. And this was one of the puzzles that they're trying also, or I would say one of the chess games they're trying to play against Hezbollah there. But speaking of the OPCW, they didn't blame the Syrian government directly of using sarin gas, right, in al-Ghouta, but it all indicates that the Syrian government used it the way the wording was of the, let's say, the latest report of the OPCW. And now, after the alleged chemical attack in Douma in 2018, and when the whistleblowers went in public and they leaked I would say, their conclusions that were taken off of the last report of the OPCW. Do you also treat the OPCW as a biased in especially on the administration level? I would say, because the investigators are definitely objective, biased, and professional, but we're talking about the administration that tried to cherry pick the findings of the OPCW investigators. So do you think after the scandal of al-Ghouta report, can we trust what the OPCW concluded in the past before the Douma chemical attack, which includes the Ghouta chemical attack?
Yeah, I mean, the OPCW as a UN organization is open to manipulation, by the US, Britain, France. And so we definitely see that in regards to the reports on Douma, and it's proven given based on these leaks that you mentioned. But in the case of 2013, you can see evidence that the OPCW leadership, and here I'm talking specifically of Angela Kane, to me it seems like that they were being pressured or collaborating essentially with the US, Britain, and France as far as the investigation goes. And there's a couple indications of that. I mean, the main one is even Angela Kane's refusal or the OPCW's refusal to try to just dig up some of the bodies and do testing on the bodies of the victims of the Ghouta attack in 2013. The OPCW refused to do that, but that would have been the easiest way to figure out, well, what really happened here? Yeah, we know some sarin was shot in these rockets, which again appeared to be a pretty small amount, but how did the people actually die? Did they really die of sarin? Or did they die of something else with a few, rockets with sarin being shot as kind of a cover or a deception? And Angela Kane, who is, I forget her exact title, but she was, a top OPCW official for the UN. She talked about how, we didn't need to exhume the bodies, like they can't tell us anything about how these people died. Let's stick with interviewing these witnesses that were provided to us by Jaish al-Islam, so that she tried to make sure that the investigation stayed totally away from actually testing any of the bodies of the people who actually died to see how they died, and instead just focus on, the testimony of witnesses who had been, provided to the on-the-ground investigators by the opposition themselves. And again, as we could talk about more, it turns out most of the victims were probably suffocated using either cyanide or carbon monoxide, which this great, very long, detailed report by a pharmacologist named Dennis O'Brien makes clear. And so Angela Kane refusing to exhume the bodies, that's one indication among several that there was an effort by the top officials in the OPCW to manipulate the outcome of the report for sure. It seems to me that Ake Selstrom was quite honest in trying to do the best he could. But Angela Kane specifically, she seemed to be very corrupt and essentially working with the US and British and French to make sure that there was an outcome of the investigation that, again, they didn't have the mandate to specifically say the Syrian government did it, but they had to have a report written that would essentially
conclude. Yeah, if you read it, you would get the impression that
it was definitely the Syrian government. Yeah,
because it wasn't in their duty back then to point out who committed the crime, but all the indications, if you read the report, they don't name the government, but it's pretty obvious that they mean the Syrian government back then.
Also
and
some small indications that, again, whoever was writing the report, they were trying to subtly give some clues about what was happening. And one clue of that is that they mentioned just kind of casually in passing that these Salafist militias were manipulating the sites for evidence and planting rockets and bringing things and taking things away from the sites and bringing things. So it's it's interesting to look at all these. Again, the same thing with the U.S. government. It's not like the entire U.S. government wanted to do this. There's different groups within it. Some are trying to be honest and do the right thing, and others, again, John Brennan and the CIA, are trying to carry out this terrible crime. And same thing with OPCW. You can see some people trying to do the right thing, and then others, trying to collaborate with the intelligence agencies and to cover it up. So in any institution, you're going to get this tension between people on different sides of the issue, and that's definitely the case, as you mentioned, in Duma. And for me, it's like, if you know that the 2013 chemical attack was a false flag done by this, coalition of intelligence agencies led by Brennan and Bandar, I mean, then it's just obvious, of course, that any of these later attacks, especially ones with chlorine, which isn't even particularly deadly or viewed traditionally as a chemical weapon, I mean, that just makes it even more obvious that all these subsequent attempts in the later years, whether at Khan Sheikhoun or in Duma, et cetera, that these, also were just additional false flag attempts to try to keep the pressure on the Syrian government in subsequent years. And so understanding the 2013 attack, I think, is the most important.
William, when you follow such big events, I would say, at least you should be serious, right, in conducting your research. And even if you're not researching, you're just monitoring it, right? Like, there are crazy things that happened during the Syrian war that it's mind-blowing. For example, the Khan Sheikhoun alleged chemical attack in 2017. There was no OPCW investigators on the ground, and they claimed that it's very dangerous for them to go there, and they collected the samples through the White Helmets and other jihadi groups in that part. And there are videos, by the way, when the White Helmets collecting samples, right? And it's in the middle of a road, and there is like a dead, diseased pigeon. It's like you don't know from where that pigeon came. So they're taking that pigeon and putting in a bag. And then there are people with a motor or with a bicycle passing the scene, near the scene, and they're asking, what's going on here? And there's someone says, sarin gas. And it's like, how can any serious person cannot see this as a funny scene, really? Because as people are walking with their sandals near the alleged chemical attack scene, and people are collecting samples while there are people with barefoot are walking nearby, and nothing is happening to them, of course. This is a sarin gas, not a chlorine gas. And then you have the Duma attack, alleged chemical attack again. The bomb fell from the rooftop and it slept over the bed as if it has no weight, Like, if you understand anything from physics, it's not possible for any cylinder to come from the rooftop and sit over the bed as if it's a sleeping time, and it doesn't damage the bed as well. So these are silly observations, but they're serious, If you watch these pictures of people who are collecting the samples or taking selfies in a chemical attack scene, these are not serious investigations to begin with. How can you make conclusions out of it? Or then you have, for example, the Amnesty International report about the Saydnaya prison. And I haven't read all the reports, by the way, but I went through the methodology, for example, and it's all based on testimonies. And maybe once or twice eyewitnesses, it's okay. But if you build an entire case in investigation based on what a person A and B and C without names told you in Turkey and in Lebanon, and then I would raise serious questions, and I would take it with a grain of salt, right? There could be some truth in it, but just the way it's conducted, it's not scientific, and the way it is presented as a fact, it's unbelievable, right? You cannot be a serious person and a serious researcher and use that in your research, because any research is based on a methodology and a literature review. And then when you read the methodology and it says they're just interviewing anonymous people, how can I take that seriously? So there are so many things happened during the Syrian war that were really unbelievably silly, ridiculous, and the claims are, it insults your intelligence, right? And when you ask this so-called mainstream journalists and they treat you as a ship, right? And when you start really questioning this narrative, they get really aggressive. And it happened to me so many times during these 11, 12 years of war. I have met countless number of mainstream journalists for interviews or just for chatting. And for me, it's pretty obvious. Some of them, they are genuine people, but most of them are wolves in the clothing of a ship. And when they realize like they can't buy you, they can't manipulate you, they can't persuade you, and they can't spoil you with these incentives, right? Because if you become one of them, there are so many incentives too. So they start hating you. And this happened to me so many times. My experience is so horrible with the mainstream journalists. Like you give a statement to them and then they cherry pick your statements. And when they interview you, it's not live. They just show like 30 seconds of what you say and they try to portray you as a crazy person, you know? So unfortunately, this is the situation, and people like yourself are very important to be in this scene to seriously analyze and conduct research about these cases. And at the end of the day, people who want really serious people who want to research and read and understand the Syrian war, let them judge which one is more believable, your article that you published recently or the claims and the pictures that we've seen in the media. If you want to follow your emotions, of course, you would believe the mainstream media. But if you want to follow your sanity, you should at least consider what researchers like yourself are posting. And I would like to ask you, William, where the people can follow your work like regularly. I would like to refer your work to my Syriana Analysis. Where do you usually post your articles?
So I always write for the Libertarian Institute, and I forget the Twitter handle, but I can send it to you if you want to put it in the show notes.
I will definitely put the Twitter handler in the description below so that the people follow you. But you mostly usually
my own Twitter is probably the best place. So my handle is my first initial W, and then my last name VanWagenen. So if you follow me on Twitter, when I put out a new article, I always, of course, will tweet it out. So that's probably the best place.
That's the perfect place for the people to follow your work. And also, if you can, guys, read the research that William posted, I will put the link also in the description below. Take your time, print it out like I did, make some highlights, save it for later. It's important. William Van Wagenen, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It was really a pleasure to have you on Syriana Analysis and discuss with you this very important case that has changed the course of the Syrian war. And now after the emotions are like little bit calmer, we can discuss about it in a more objective way. And I hope the audience would take a chance to listen, and also those who were suspicious would learn something, and those who believe the mainstream media, maybe they could raise some questions.
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me on. I always really enjoy speaking with you, and I appreciate it a lot.
My pleasure.
Thanks.